Hi, Mathia.
Hello,
How's it going?
it's going well. We're
Good. Can you
currently,
make me the host?
yes,
Because we are not going to let, so we don't need. Okay.
see.
All right. Hi, Pamela. All right. Um, we only we are going to only let the folks who signed up in. And apparently, the news sender shared the Zoom link in their story, which is not good.
I have put you as the co-host now.
Yes, I saw that. Thank you.
Good.
I'm going to turn off my VPN and it's going to kick me out and then I'll come back.
Okay, noted.
Can you hear me, Mattia?
Yes, I can hear you.
Mattia, are you letting people in?
Yes, I'm admitting.
Please don't.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Reza. How's it going? You're muted.
Apologies.
Muted. How
How
are
are
you?
you? In
Glad to see you,
Tehran
man.
already?
Yes, absolutely, son. Where's Mo?
I think he's coming. He actually sent me the Zoom link.
Okay.
How are you doing?
Hopefully, I'm doing all right. So happy to see you, man.
Excellent. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
And
much for inviting.
absolutely, man. Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you're doing that for I mean, we have an international audience, but it's like it's Tehran Summit. So we're inviting one of the most influential Iranian
Bunch of
philosophers. So
Iranians gathering.
yes,
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 yes.
yes. And I mean, you're going to talk to your fan base in Iran, basically.
I
So
know, I know.
that's a
And
great
and you know, it's
opportunity,
this is since I left Iran.
right?
It's the first time that I'm actually talking to my own people.
Yeah. And that's actually what Babak Moaqqi said last year at the summit. And it's strange because, well, I mean, you two guys are doing some of the most amazing things, in the world of philosophy. And no, I'm serious, but um, people should know about you.
Jason is a very, you know that one of the most unfortunate things is that Jason told me that apparently he could go to Iran at some point. You know, he has never gone to Iran.
Yeah, do you think he doesn't want to risk it?
I don't think he's born in America,
Right.
right?
And this stuff is so cryptic. The
Yes,
state
yeah, nobody
hasn't been able to
really,
decode it
yes, but
yet.
I mean, first of all, he needs to get a passport, Iranian passport. I
Right.
don't think that it would
That's true.
be, I think that that wouldn't be easy.
That's also true. You're right. That's also true.
Because he will be considered as an American.
Right. And not a regular American, you know?
Not a
Not a
regular
random Joe,
spy
you know?
American.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
A
exactly.
spy American.
An
Yes.
American that is very fluent in Farsi and
Yes,
knows
yes.
about the all the ulum khafiya stuff. So
Yes,
kind
yes.
of sus.
No, I mean, and it's quite sad, because he absolutely loves to come to Iran and see the place.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Has he ever?
No, never, never.
Interesting.
One second, I will go get a ashtray and a cigarette for
Sure,
myself, and
sure,
then I will go.
sure, sure. Mo?
Hello?
Hey, Marcia. Just checking if Mo was. Yes. Okay, I was right. Dada home. Emo.
چطوری عرفان ما اینجاییم
Hey, how's it going? Yes, I saw you, man. رضا رفت زیر سیگاری بیاره. Like always. Okay, it's here. Okay, Reza, about the introduction and stuff, the way we want to open the session. I'm going to
Whenever.
Yeah, I'm going to read a passage from Quran. It's here. It's because it's you. And
Quran
that's
Kareem.
actually سوره تکویر. هنگامی
Yes.
که آفتاب تاریک شود و ستارگان آسمان تیره شود. So we're gonna start with that. And I'm going to try to read it in Arabic language. And then,
Excellent.
yes,
With the caveat that unfortunately Iranians don't have a great capacity to pronounce Arabic.
yes, they don't. And
Yes, they
do you
don't.
think do you think I should read the English translation or Farsi translation as well, or just leave it as it is?
The English translation would be nice.
Okay. So after reading from Quran, I'll read the English translation and then read the introduction text, and then the floor will be yours. You good?
Excellent.
Mo, you good?
Excellent.
Good to see you, brother. Good to see you, brother. And I'll let everyone in. Great. We have, all right, 80 people. Hello, everyone. Okay. People are still joining, so
No worries.
okay. And I've sent the link to a friend of mine that knows Puya Gholami, so hopefully he will join as well. Not sure if he's here already.
قلقل هست که خب خوبه.
Oh, yes. I'm not sure if we can let everyone in, but it is crowded. That's what happens when we join forces, man.
I'm gonna do a very special introduction of Reza Negarestani when it comes like after you reciting
Yes.
the verses of Quran. Yes.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hi, Kosajan. Hi, Puya. Okay. Okay. Shall we start? Okay, great. So I'm going to read the Takfir Surah from Quran, which is one of the like the primary examples of deep objects, one of the first manuals of world engineering, and one of the greatest examples of theory fiction as well. So
one of the greatest socialist texts in history.
yes, definitely. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم كدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا إشار قتلت وإذا وحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت وإذا صحف نشرت وإذا السماء كشطت وإذا جحيم سعرت وإذا الجنة أزلفت علمت نفس ما أحذرت فلا أقسم بالخنس الجبار الخنس والليل إذا عسعس والصبح إذا تنفس إنه لقول رسول كريم لقول رسول كريم ذي قوة عند ذي العرش مكين مطاع ثم أمين وما صاحبكم بمجنون ولقد راه بالأفق مبين وما هو على غیب بالزنین وما هو بقول الشیطان الرجیم فأين تذهبون إن هو إلا اذكر للعالمين لمن شاء منكم أن يستقيم وما تشاءون إلا أن يشاء الله رب العالمين. Let me read the English translation for the ones that don't know what I just read, and then we are going to start the session with Mohammad Salemy and Reza Negarestani. It was Surah Takvir, or the folding up. When the sun, with its spacious light, is folded up, when the stars fall, losing their luster, when the mountains vanish like mirages, when the she-camels, 10 months with young, are left untended, when the wild beasts are herded together in human habitations, when the oceans boil over with a swell, when the souls are sorted out, being joined like with like, when the female infant buried alive is questioned for what crime she was killed, when the scrolls are laid open, when the world on high is unveiled, when the blazing fire is kindled to fierce heat, and when the garden is brought near, shall each soul know what it has put forward then. So verily I call to witness the planets that recede, go straight or hide, and the night as it dissipates, and the dawn as it breathes away the darkness. Verily, this is the word of the most honorable messenger, endowed with power, with rank, before the Lord of the throne, with authority there, and faithful to his trust. And O people, your companion is not one possessed, and without doubt he saw him in the clear horizon. Neither does he withhold grudgingly a knowledge of the unseen, nor is it the word of an evil spirit accursed. Whither go you? Verily, this is no less than a message to all the worlds. To whomever among you wills to go straight with profit, but you shall not will accept as Allah wills, the cherisher of the worlds. Hello everyone, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the 4th edition of the Tehran Summit, a virtual space for critical thought and artistic resistance, free from the territorializing forces. My name is Erfan Riyasi, and I'm the co-creator of the Summit 03 with Una Matisan Yerede. The fourth summit is a collaboration between both the Association of Visual Artists of Oslo and the New Center for Research and Practice. We begin this year with a return to Cyclonopedia, Complicity with Anonymous Materials, Reza Negarestani's 2007 text that blurred philosophy, geopolitics, and horror fiction into a petropolitical mythology. 16 years on, the book remains a volatile relic, less a closed text than a living virus that continues to infect contemporary philosophy, art, and other anonymous materials. What does it mean to revisit Cyclonopedia today amid algorithmic myth-making, new wars, and planetary decay? To explore this, we are honored to host a dialogue between Reza Negarestani, whose philosophical work continues to challenge the limits of thought, and Mohammad Salemy, curator, theorist, and organizer of the New Center, whose curatorial and intellectual practice probes the nexus of art, technology, and power. Please join me in welcoming them for our opening conversation, Cyclonopedia Revisited 2007 to 2023. Thank you, Reza. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think Mo wants to say something before I start. Mohammed.
Yes, sorry, my microphone was off. So I wanted to do a little introduction of you, but rather than reading a biography of yours from the New Center website or tens of other platforms where you've participated or contributed text, and they all have some sort of your bio for that, people can go online and find. I wanted to give a biography of you from my own point of view and how we've met and how we work together. It won't be that long, but I think it's kind of essential, especially to the kind of like conversation that we're going to have today. I became aware of you through hearing about Cyclonopedia sometime in 2008, 2009. But to be honest, I was both scared of it and
I'm a skeptic.
I was skeptic because I was in a different headspace and didn't know how to approach it, actually. And when I was doing a bit of a residency in New York in the fall of 2012, when the word came that Reza Negarestani is arriving from Malaysia to New York, I made sure to come to your first and second lectures 2 days in a row. One was an event you did with Florian Hecker. You basically read some text while some experimental sound and noise music play in the background. I wasn't convinced with that either, but I didn't give up. And I showed up today to Miguel Abro, where you gave your very first lecture on the problems of computation. And I immediately knew I'm dealing with a very serious force in Persian philosophy. And if you remember, I was sitting in the front row, the room was packed with people, there were people sitting on the floor, and I was the first one to come to the front and basically greet you and ask you to give me those diagrams that were in the room. And those diagrams are in my art collection. And I remember going back home and calling my friends like Mina Khanlarzadeh and others and saying like, I think we have a real serious thinker amongst us that we should take seriously. And, I was also at the end of a very depressing personal journey. A relationship of mine had come to an end. And this moment was very important for me because I felt like gates of heaven just opened. Not that I had met my next romantic lover or something, but I just felt like I met my next collaborator for decades to come. And as you know, we've been working with each other since then. I invited you to the project that ended up becoming Cyclonospace Iranica exhibition. I asked a group of Iranian artists to respond to your lecture at Miguel Abro Gallery. I have the catalog of that show with many names here. A lot of them have gone on to become well-known artists. Abbas Akhavan, who will be representing Canada in Venice Biennale this year. Tala Madani, one of the greatest painters from Iran. And Anahita Razmi and Raha Raisnia, plus Ali Ahadi, which will be opening a show, a collaborative work in Hayward Gallery and in Delfino Foundation this fall, together with another artist. I forgot the name, but I have to bring the name because for those of you who are from London, I will be coming to attend the opening, and it will be great to see and hang out with you. What is interesting about Reza is that Reza is one of those dynamic thinkers that doesn't get stuck in a bunch of $5 words that he invented and keep repeating the same and dwelling over the same concepts. I caught up with you at the end of your radical speculation period, where you were still kind of affiliated with what was called back then speculative realism, even though you never called yourself a speculative realist, and object-oriented ontology and all that stuff. And I was there to see your transformation from that into what became Prometheanism, New Rationalism. I saw your interest in Chinese philosophy, in Hegel, in Carnap, and you constantly shift your direction, but you never. It's an additive process where things from your past research and thought are compressed, and then new stuff gets added. And that's really the force that you are, unlike many people, that you're able to basically do 2 step forward, 1 step back, 2 step forward, 1 step back. And this is a new Reza that we're seeing today. The best way for people to understand where you are with your project is the paper you presented in Berlin last September, which is still available online for people who want the link, which you're problematizing basically talking about the Eastern roots of Western Enlightenment and what went wrong with the Western Enlightenment, and how you perform a kind of epidemiology on Western Enlightenment. And I think that's sort of like where you are, and hopefully some of that will come through the talk today. I don't have much more to add to that, but I'll be around to basically ask you a question and talk with you about some of the stuff you bring up, and let's see where we take the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mohammed. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who is involved in organizing this event. Irfan, his partner, and of course, the News Center, who has always been supporting me throughout all these years. So it is kind of strange at this point for me. Irfan mentioned that, of course, Cyclonopedia was published in 2008, but Cyclonopedia as a manuscript was finished in 2005. So it's now 20 years. Unfortunately, my first publisher went bankrupt. And, once you are attached to a certain sort of publisher and it goes bankrupt, you will have a very hard time to find a new publisher. Regardless of that matter, I told Mo that and also Irfan, that this is the first time that I'm actually, since I've left Iran, I'm talking to people of my own flesh and blood. And of course, we have complex relationships. Iranians always have complex relationships with one another. But it is absolutely a humbling experience to talk once again to the Iranian audience. And I understand that there is a certain sort of what you might call to be buzz about Cyclonopedia. And I don't want to give the same sort of stuff that I have given the Western audience just merely to sell the book. I want to be honest with you guys and essentially let you know how such a book can be written in the first place. And of course, I also need to thank Peyman Olami for translating this book. Magnificent translation.
Just to add that the book is the next publication by Triple Ampersand Publications, and we're working on finalizing the design, and it will be soon available for pre-sale and order through the Triple Ampersand platform.
So, in that sense, let me start with a very humble, but also rather necessary thing to say, where this book came from. I think that everyone among my peers in Iran Tufan al-Maharib want to know a little bit or two about where this book came from. And of course, if I am Irfan, if I am allowed to, can I add one or two words about the event itself? This event within which, I'm talking about. Muhammad knows, and sometimes he gets very livid, that Reza is a loose cannon. Everyone knows that. That I do talk in all honesty. I do not chew words. And that, of course, creates a certain sort of tension. But I want to, precisely because I am talking to the people who I genuinely care for, namely Iranians, even though I am miles away from you at this point, but I do care for you. And I have no knowledge of right now in Iran what it looks like, even though, I left Iran at the end of the 2000 aughts, 2009 was it? But nevertheless, it always comes back. It's a kind of a haunting experience for someone who goes away and then talks to Iranians ever again. So, Irfan, am I allowed to talk a little bit critical bits as well while I am talking about the event, but also while I'm talking about Cyclonopedia?
Sure. It's your night, man.
Thank you so much, my dear friend. So, I would say that if we are going to make a title for this, Cyclonopedia Revisited, I also want to add a subtitle to this, a reevaluation of the concept of darkness. Right. We Iranians know the concept of darkness far more than so many other people. So how I wrote Cyclonopedia, of course, the book, as I mentioned, was finished in 2005 as a new modernized mythology from the place I emerged. My idea was that no amount of biographical background make me fit by any sort of definition to write an experimental piece on the Middle East. It would be preposterous for me to claim that I represent the Middle East. I am merely one subject among so many who have been traumatized by the experience of the horrors. And of course, these horrors, not all of them, you might say, to be endemic to the land, as Cyclonopedia apparently, purports to be, but the majority of them are coming from the outside, not really the Lovecraftian outside.
Reza, your
But
camera went off.
my apologies. but rather the outside that we know of, the Western side. So, regardless of the fact that my family were intensively involved in the revolution or the in Iran-Iraq war, what needed to be done was to surreptitiously eject the author, not in a French way of the death of the author sort of gimmick, but implicating the author into a far more expansive horizon where the author simply melts away by its own accord. Because let's say there are more pressing issues here than who wrote this goddamn book or who didn't. It is really not a big deal who wrote this book. And of course, I'm referring to the conspiracy theories and all the gossip. Look, uh, I remember that I read number of really wide-eyed stuff back in the day when Cyclonopedia came that, you know, an Iranian author behind this is too good to be true. Yes, of course. The problem of author as literary subject who wrote this book, or the problem of author as literary subject who has undergone trauma was out of the window to begin with. That sort of sappy love for the author and live characters who confess their pains and make the small world of the literary fiction fall in love with the complexity of their character and their world in which they retain their status as number one surreptitious protagonists must be undone by any means possible. In that sense, maybe literature, as understood post the avant-garde, is in fact not the most optimal medium to relay such ideas and configuration of a structuration, power, and victimhood. And of course, you know that literature will always love victims. But you see, we are Iranians. We never played victims. If we had played victims, we would have been in a different, better place. Even though we have been traumatized, left in, right in, any sort of historical imagination that you allow you to have a morsel of decency to think about the history of contemporary Iran shows you that these are truly traumatized people, except that they refuse, they by definition refuse to be literary victims, right? In that sense, maybe literature, as I said, as understood post the avant-garde, is not the most optimal medium to relay such ideas and configurations. Abide by its norms, you will most likely win a Pulitzer Prize or something akin to it. After all, what is literally unsubjectivated subject of the Middle East, you might ask? I hope it won't be a Middle Eastern Proust whining and gossiping about his traumas in dazzling literary ways, day in and day out. The only disturbance against of this sort of what you might call literary fiction is a genuine trauma, right? A trauma that transmits through the collective memory. We Iranians are people who have nothing to lose and nothing to gain by emulating a protagonist of Proust, for that matter, or for that matter, by any European giant of literary fiction. For us, literature and poetry is the blood and life when we have a slight privilege to breathe, to survive from one day to another. So the grand scheme of the author, or any sort of character of that level, so to speak, protagonist or antagonist, at that point during the writing of Cyclonopedia ought to have been discarded and ejected with ultimate prejudice. I remember what I thought of it at that point, mentioning, ironically, yet another French writer, because Iranians are somehow closeted Francophiles, all of them. We are not going to say this to the other people. French writer, given yet another French writer, given how we have been pervasively and encroached upon by this unquestioned Francophilia for quite a while, and how this Francophilia has taken the better of us, fortunately. I thought of Émile Zola back then, and particularly Émile Zola's response to one of his critics who had claimed literature is about living people and extremely lavish sort of characters. Characters were just full of French, opulence of various qualities. And then the punchline against Zola was that, well, Zola's characters in the novels have no redeeming quality that can bring them to the living sphere of the so-called higher literature, i.e. literary fiction, saturated with grand, well-constructed characters. And of course, here is Zola's answer, which I adopted. And this is Zola's answer to his critic. My friend, literature is about life. And life is larger than any well-developed character that could be imagined by prize-worthy forms of literature. That, of course, I saw from Zola. Literature is not just about life, but what makes life possible to begin with. And that is the outside, or what I call the open, is by all definition more expansive than any puppet or literary character in the literary fiction that literary fiction had yet put together. But of course, you could somehow reiterate what I just said about literature also, works can be applied to the
works of
definition of
art.
philosophy. To philosophy. I'm not going to say about art to philosophy because I'm not an artist. I'm going to say philosophy. And the fact that my choices, at least in Cyclonopedia, are kind of like, Francophile, Deleuze and Guattari and Bataille, of course, and the legacy of that sort of lineage.
You mean Nick Land? We're talking to Iranians. We can say Nick Land with freedom.
Nick Land, yes.
You know what? Just before you go on, I was flipping through Fangnomena, and I noticed that there's a little chapter there called Spinal Catastrophe. Somewhere
Yes,
in.
of course.
Then I
Yes,
went
yes,
to.
I know that.
Then I went to Spinal Catastrophe by our own lovely programmer, book of our lovely programmer, Thomas Moynihan, and I looked at both index of names and index of subjects and everywhere, and there was not a single mention of Nick Land in the book Spinal Catastrophe. And I thought, is that because we all know that Land is influential, or is it because of some kind of fear that we don't actually dare to mention the name of the Lord of Darkness. So it would be
At,
great,
at,
actually.
at the
You
beginning,
cannot, Reza. We cannot say we want to be truthful to Iranians if we don't talk about Nick Land and Nick
yes,
Land's relation.
no, I would say that at the beginning, essentially when Cyclonopedia was written, it was already assumed that Nick Land is behind everything, right? Hence the conspiracy theories. But now I would say that yes, it's a little bit of a kind of a sleazy conspiracy theory to eject the name land out of all of this. And we have to take it seriously. But anyway.
Just for those who don't know, last year Reza put his hand in his deep pocket and pulled out this text that Land had written as an introduction to Cyclonopedia. But what happened was that friends of Reza, and I'm going to name China Melville, had told Reza, don't put Land in the back or in the first page of the book because leftists in the West will completely cancel you. So this text was never published until Reza decided last summer to kind of like give it to the world, and actually kind of became one of the most visited pages on our triple ampersand, and it exists there. And in it, Land basically says, don't believe Reza is a true Muslim believer, and this book is not a critique of Islam or the Islamic world, but it actually, I mean, you can go read the text yourself and have your reading of it. But I thought it was very interesting to publish Land's never published intro to basically show some kind of lineage and genealogy of where these things, what kind of dialogues you were in when you were writing the book. Anyways, you can maybe highlight a little bit of what you think were influences of Land, or sort of like the kind of push and pull or rejection of Land that exists in a book that he was able to actually identify.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, well, I want to even go back further first, where I came from. And that's why I discovered Land in the late 90s, right? When basically Land was already in Taiwan, not in China. And was a private English tutor, if I know it correctly. And that was, you should understand the culture, the counterculture of the late 90s. It's fundamentally influenced by figures like Bataille, by Deleuze, maybe not even Deleuze, because Deleuze is something that far later. In academic circles, Derrida was the ultimate figure, right? So the counterculture of, at least counterculture of against the academic institution in the humanities, in the content of philosophical sense, was, figures like Bataille, CCRU, Land, Deleuze, Guattari, Deleuze, most importantly. And so, of course, if we were going through that sort of trajectory, it would be inevitable to not find Land. I remember when I was, still in Iran, I got this book by Nashr Markaz, written by Babak Ahmadi. I don't know if he's still alive or not. And he said something very ironic at the very beginning, that everyone in the content of philosophy at some point has to stop with Bataille. It is not as if Bataille is actually a great thinker, but it's a kind of a stopover. So, okay, let me continue with this. So, as I said, but then I would defend philosophy by pointing out that there are certain checks and balances that eventually, within the organon of history of philosophy, so to speak, and that if we take philosophy seriously, its universe of discourse, so on, it will inevitably will take us out of illusions about its figureheads, its institutional attachments, and most importantly, about its nature as a discipline that ought to be self-correcting enterprise, but often plays into the hand of tyrants and people who Aristotle cautioned us against, i.e., a breed of philosophers who lack practical wisdom, phronosis, so to speak. The same, however, now you said philosophy, art, and literature. I want to say that the same, however, cannot be said about literature, given how, in my opinion, literature does not have an acute or a stern instrument of self-disillusionment and self-consciousness that can call into question its very own vocation. This sort of controversial claim, of course, requires a much more detailed engagement, but I'm not going to talk about it right now. So at this point, one may ask, what is the genesis of Cyclonopedia, its lineage? It is by all definition a syncretic one. And the simple answer is its lineage that is ingrained in the tradition of what we can call psychology. When I say psychology, I don't mean it in the common sense we know it today, but rather to an old tradition of literature, philosophy, arts, theology, and mysticism, wherein psychology is understood as an experimental discipline for explaining peoples, now translate into actors or characters, most genuine convictions, beliefs, emotions, since emotions also have belief contents, actions, norms, and law-like customs. Yet at the beginning, this young discipline takes a very strange path. And it would be safe to say that Freud and the inner circle of early psychoanalysis, comprised of people like Chandra Frenzy and Otto Rank, is merely a culmination of this deep tradition that at least began post the advent of Neoplatonism. In experimental sciences, in natural magic, which would be proto-natural philosophy, in mysticism, in theology, philosophy, and even the logic of time, the Middle Ages. Some of the works on which Cyclonopedia is partially based were written in the same tradition, upgraded throughout ages. First two works that I remember that absolutely, as a child or as a teenager, read them and put a mark on me. Ethnophil's Hayyibni Aqsan, about the desert island. That would be, a prequel to Robinson Crusoe. And Ethnophil's Theologus Autodidactus, which is usually considered to be the first proto-science fiction. Imagine a commentary on Quran, which happens to be sci-fi, right? So, and of course, proto-science fiction, a speculative theology, educational propaganda, where the protagonist born and raised on a desert island finds itself in some sort of communion or communication of grand scale with the universe, with other inhabitants of the world and the universe through a theoretical and practical reflection on where they came from. We can stretch this particular lineage, at least for Cyclonopedia, through the birth of the so-called weird literature and the American Gothic. By the first novels of Charles Brockden Brown, also known as the father of the American Gothic fiction, the grandfather of the weird literature before even Lovecraft was a name. in these highly technical novels, which appeared extremely gimmicky to the critics of the time who were only responsive to literary values of their own time, Brown gave a very prophetic account of the American Revolution, the cost of being hijacked by the socio-economic structures already in place within pockets of conservative Christianity. And this is the gimmick or the literary device in his two books, Wieland or Transformation, An American Tale, and Memoirs of Carvin de Beluquis. All characters' motivations and desires find their roots in their interaction with a rather demonic disembodied voice from nowhere. A ventriloquist. You know what a ventriloquist is? It's someone who, for example, creates a disembodied voice and has a puppet, and the puppet, it appears that the voice is coming from the mouth of the puppet rather than the speaker, right? A ventriloquist voice, so to speak. And they, under the influence of this haunting, ghostly voice, the protagonist of Wieland, that comes from the closet, begin to commit murders of massive degree and eventually unravel. This is also why Brown's prophetic work on the incoming history of America post-revolution can also be heralded as a first instance of a literary work where the trope of conspiracy theories, of which Cyclonopedia is admittedly rife, so as today's QAnon, takes root. I am a fan of conspiracy theories, right? Precisely because they say something that you just don't want to listen, but you have to listen to it. We can continue with the secretive undercurrent history of psychologism in literature all night, but that is not that important. We could reference at least Zola in The Human Beast and the works of Sander Frenzy, a disciple of Freud. In Zola's first modern serial killer novel, we see patterns emerging among the complicity between anonymous material, industrialism, capitalism, the invention of modern railroad, and of course the industry of producing military armaments at the blink of an eye. And also, of course, sexual revolution, the obsession, and all those tropes which are bona fide French. In the case of Frenzy, as opposed to Freud, the discovery of psychology as a cosmological critique takes a different turn. Even beneath the facade of the Industrial Revolution and the colonialist construction of acquainting with the ocean through ships and ocean liners, Frenzy sees that Freud stalled at some point. The traumas, the hysterias of organic life on Earth may be in fact the result of some deeper trauma in whose recognition we might be able to graduate from terrestrial, parochial, local domains of ours, and of course our biological chauvinism, so cherished by us, our entrenched systems on the planet, to a different place.
Reza, let me read that.
The...
Let me read that Freud quote.
Yes, please go on.
Yes. So this is a quote from Psychotherapy of Hysteria. Freud says, "We have said that this material behaves like a foreign body, and that the treatment too works like the removal of a foreign body from the living tissue. We are now in a position to see where this comparison fails. A foreign body does not enter into any relations with the layers of tissue that surrounds it, although it modifies them and necessitates a reactive inflammation in them. Our pathogenic psychical group, on the other hand, does not admit of being clearly extrapolated from the ego. Its external strata pass over in every direction into portions of the normal ego, and indeed, they belong to the latter just as much as to the pathogenic organization. In analysis, the boundary between the two is fixed purely conventionally. Now at one point, now at another. And in some places, it cannot be laid down at all. The interior layers of the pathogenetic organization are increasingly alien to the ego, but once more without there being any visible boundary at which the pathogenic material begins. In fact, the pathogenic organization does not behave like a foreign body, but far more like an infiltrate. Again, from the psychotherapy of hysteria from 1895.
Yes, thank you so much, Mo. So, yes, Cyclonopedia is what you might say that beyond the scope of metaphor takes, this history of psychology that, culminates in the early psychoanalysis very seriously, right? And then the question comes back to this. So, so within this sort of tradition, so we know that we are living in the Middle East. We are organic species. We are, we have been trading with oils. We have this sort of history and so on and so forth. So essentially, what does it mean to conduct self-discovery? Cyclonopedia is a work about self-discovery in the Middle East. It is not written essentially for Western people, even though it has copious amounts of references to Western literature and philosophers and so on and so forth, right? And that's why it's so confusing to a Western reader where such a work comes from. Well, of course, given the fact that no living organism can do this sort of self-discovery with minimum damage, the self-discovery of our own species, and of course, here in the Middle East, and the planet as a whole, I would say, most likely takes a weird slant that the horror genre or even the pulp noir are more equipped to talk about than, let's say, literary fiction. Grand sense of literature, so to speak. This is why someone like Howard Philip Lovecraft has a veritable prime racist who simply thinks of us as progenies of the great spore god of chaos, deity Yog-Sothoth, is more relevant than another white person penning the greatest literary fiction at this point and win a Booker's Prize, Pulitzer Prize, or Nobel, for that matter. So ultimately, Cyclonopedia, given all these considerations, was founded on a multi-scale account of people's psychology who try to embark on a journey in the great mythical tradition of catabasis, going to the dead, falling into the abyss, self-discovery. Where to live in the Middle East already meant by a Western romanticism living in the desert, and to live in contemporary Middle East meant living by oil. But we are Middle Eastern. We are not going to shy away how to sell our products. to the Western audience. As victims or protagonists of this subterranean odyssey, we Middle Easterners should do better to synthesize modernity and modern literature, not just from the early 20th century, but everything that must have been written about our region with philosophical, critical, and revolutionary ideas that has come from our own very locale of thought. But this is obviously a no-go to some people here and there. In this hard-won zone of suffering, which we call our Iran, by all definitions, hard-won, with its nebulous claims upon lands and the way it connects to the West. Let me pour out, and this is the little bit of criticism before Mo opens up, and then I do talk about the structure of Cyclonopedia and so on and so forth. So then let me pour out some criticism here before I go back and talk about Cyclonopedia for people who are truly part of my blood, and who have gone through a series of the most unfair and unfortunate events in recent history, but always keeping their heads up against the forms of exploitation, tyranny, almost to a fault. I remember I told Mo that Iranians always keep their head up. And then Mo told me that maybe that's the fault. But we do this to a fault, I would say so. We do not want to appear as victims. So this is a criticism. And Irfan, by no means you should take this as a criticism about this great event, because I understand that Iranians always need, being confined, we need to get out, talk to other sort of people, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, if I needed to give a critique here, is that why do we have here in this event, organized by the greatest efflux, who really just doesn't have that much knowledge of Iran, where this event is taking place, even virtually, some handmaidens and sophistic prophecies of anti-Deutsch people who are fantastic about talking about authoritarian society and authoritarian conception of a chatbot. But when it comes to actual concrete historical events, just like the artists of the human centipede succumb back into their own carapace and sing the songs of anti-Deutsch, complete denial of what is really happening in our region, right? This is not a way we Iranian intellectuals live, survive, and evolve over time. We have a recent tradition whose rather all predecessors have been murdered, assassinated, taken their own lives or died in depression, in exile, or in their own countries just because they knew what they are truly against. We expect more than ourselves. Precisely because of this, we often find ourselves in head to head collision with some of the most sinister and yet seductive forces on the planet, for which we now have vague names: rabid capitalism, anti Deutsch, soft Zionism, neoliberalism, European silence par excellence. And then Mo, take it from here.
You know, throughout the last year and a half, 2 years, you and me have been discussing a lot about what is happening in the world. And I kept disagreeing with you about the centrality of the events in the Middle East to the dialectics of our time. But recently, I kind of like realized that maybe Reza was right, and really, with these rapid developments that are taking place, especially after Donald Trump's visit to Dubai, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, I feel like your your reading your reading of what is happening in the world and how important the development in the Middle East are, and how peripheral the rest of it, including the Ukraine war, which I argued is probably more important, has been. So I wanted to like highlight how basically, I don't know if you noticed or not, but like as you were making your opening remarks, Donald Trump basically issued a truth social about his 2 hour conversation with Putin and his subsequent call to European leaders. And basically, as it seems, Vatican is decided by this crazy king to be the place that negotiation will take place. And it seems like there will be no ceasefire prior to negotiation. So yeah, and also how basically it seems like some of the words in the book, this aggressive war that's being fought defensively in the Middle East, is kind of wrapping up and becoming the shape-shifting event, given how US seems to be abandoning Israel as its main ally and basically accepting that they have to go with the fate decided for the region by those forces who are excelled in making money rather than making money through debt. And as you know, US's credit rating was just downgraded yesterday, right? So yeah, so Donald Trump is out there to make some money off the region. So it will be interesting to kind of like take a look at what's happening right now in the last couple of weeks in the world in the context of this thing that takes place in a book, which you called, again, I said it again, this aggressive war that this anonymous material, petroleum, or Islam, if you want to call it, this aggressive war that it has invited the enemy to fight, to invite the enemy, which is the West, to the land of the Middle East to fight a very aggressive war that seems to be defensive, but is actually an aggressive war.
Uh, yes, I mean, there are a lot of great points here. I would say that, we talked about this. I think that, of course, maybe Trump is, kind of at this point, of course, all the news is about this. And of course, really, genuinely, I mean, Western news needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Sure, maybe Trump is alienating certain Israeli entities and so on and so forth. But we should understand that American empire, by all definition, will support Israel to the end of the game, right? It's just that now there is a conflict, as you said it. where basically we have a president who literally is the epitome of business as usual. What always America was about, right? Business as usual. And then, okay, let me not talk about politics that much, but bring it back to our art world. And hence my criticism. We should, as Iranian, we should not have this sort of attitude that it's business as usual. We can talk about, you know, triple O, Latour's networks, let's say AI chatbots, authoritarians, however they may be. No, because we don't really have anything. And we are the very few people on the planet who should know better. That the business as usual is not our game. Might be their game. But we have fallen for this sort of trap over and over again. Except that you can't really try to deceive an Iranian who lives in Iran by business as usual. Everyone knows what is already going on with this Trump's trip into the Middle East. It's business as usual, right? Capitalism trumps over other sorts of agendas.
Like morality,
what
ideology, ethics, history.
Yes, but we as intellectuals should not actually fall for this in the slightest sort of way to say that, well, you know, art is as usual, business as usual. Well, that would be just a mimic of the Trump's visit to the Middle East. We are not supposed to do this. Maybe we could do this a couple of decades ago. Maybe during Obama, that would be even a stretch, right? I'm just trying to be a jokester here. But not after everything that has happened, you know? I think, and you see, so this is why, okay, so maybe we are not going actually to talk about Cyclonopedia as a structure. And then maybe I actually just publish the text with triple ampersand and everyone can read it.
No, we can talk about that, but I just thought that.
No, I think precisely because there are more important things to say. You see, Muhammad, if I try for some reason to pretend that Cyclonopedia is about the contemporary time, it was contemporary when it was written, right? It kind of prophetically envisioned the rise of ISIS. People back in 2005 didn't know even what might ISIS look like, right? So, but I cannot talk about it as if it is relevant right
Reza,
now.
there's something in the structure of the book that actually can help us with the current discussion.
Okay.
It's a very basic one.
I just don't want to appear as a revisionist here, right?
You know, the basic structure is that there's something going on the surface, and you can see that in the first chapter,
Sure.
which is sort of like set from the point of view of your partner, right? And then, but that tension on the surface, which is represented by the Westerner in the book, or Westerners in a book, really all it can do is basically is a futile search. It cannot find what it's looking for, because what it's looking for is beyond its reach, right? So that's the second layer of the book, the frustration and how things don't seem to be able to be resolved on the surface. And then there's the hidden layer, what's really happening, which is underneath the earth. It's, you want to call it petroleum, you want to call it the sentient being, you want to call it the anonymous material. So if you can take this three-sided structure that you set up in a book, the top layer, that's sort of like unresolved tension that the top layer cannot resolve on the surface without digging a hole and getting lost, as you said, in the abyss, and then what's really taking place underneath in the darkness, right? So if you can just take this structure and maybe we can just not even talk about the book. Up to you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. So, as I mentioned, I mean, this introduction about, the history of psychology in literature. The psychology, people really think about it as kind of like, matters of the psyche. Yes, of course, we are talking about the matters of psyche, but not in a modern sense, where basically, psychology has taken a certain sort of connotation, specific to literary fiction, and we have a common sense idea of psychology, right? Matters of psyche. That the characters, protagonists, actors in literature, in any sort of medium, uh, essentially can be explained by something deeper. But that something deeper is not really deep enough. It's not abyssal enough, right? Psychology was supposed to be a discipline to unbind the depth of characters' desires, motivations, actions, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, post-avant-garde modernism, and probably even earlier than that, it kind of got stuck with a certain sort of surface, a certain sort of a scale from which everything could be talked about, and the characters, can be related to, as we know that. And you have a happy ending or a bad ending format of literature. But within the psychological tradition that I mentioned, which is coming, which goes through literally most probably late antiquity to Renaissance, and then ultimately culminates in the early works of psychoanalysis by the inner circle, Freud's early essays, Otto Rank, Sound of Frenzy. We are talking about a certain sort of a scale problem of how to explain people's motivation, desires, actions, beliefs, so on and so forth. The first layer, the first, what you might say, the first layer has been usually associated with the mystical tradition or the spiritual tradition. You can see it in the works of Einul Quzat Hamedani, in Suhrawardi, which usually corresponds with the so-called canonical tradition of alchemical processes, right? This is about darkness. Dark. Cyclonopedia is a work about darkness. It reevaluates the concept of darkness, right? And this darkness, usually in that tradition, which went through the Middle Ages, synthesized with the West, is often in English or Latin is called Putrefactio Tenebrosa or Nigredo, the black work, or the black flame. The idea of the black flame, شعله سیاه, the کار سیاه, is this, where basically you just work with a conception of Earth which is not of the surface, but of the depth. Because we often think of the Earth, mistake it as if what is really about Earth and how all our desires originating are because of, the biological affordance for, for you to be alive as a character, as a human being. But no, you don't. You have to go deeper, to the depth of the Earth. What is the depth of the Earth? In geological terms, it's the core. And this core was represented in the Middle Ages by a black sun. And this black sun has fundamentally Aryanistic and racist connotations. There is a reason that the black sun was adopted by the feudal order during the National Socialism in Germany as a kind of wheel of time. And the idea is that Earth gets its light from the sun, but what makes it to maintain its, a structure is a sun beneath it, entrenched within its core, right? This is called the black sun. And the black sun is, of course, Hamid Parsani, who is the protagonist of Cyclonopedia, calls it a rotten sun, namely a reference to the rotten ideology of Aryanism, which have plagued our nation for so long. Then, above this, what you might call to be a reversal of the relation between life and Earth, the source of energy, the excess of energy, and Earth, is the crust. What is the crust? It is a fundamentally what you might call to be a very porous sort of substance within which the influence of the depth of the abyss of the black sun seeps through. And then on top layer, you just get subjects, characters.
Business as usual.
Business as usual. Proust wakes up every morning despite his disliking and writes the time lost, right? So imagine that within this tradition of psychology, and that's what Cyclonopedia is, we are trying to reverse this order. And this is Freud's understanding of hysteria and also frenzy, of trauma. That to understand trauma is to understand the behaviors at different stages of life. And we are going to even take it even beyond the idea of life by saying that for someone who has been undergoing massive amount of trauma, right? On the surface level, to a psychoanalyst, or even to the patient himself, everything seems all right. Sun, as Irfan said it in the Surah Al-Takwir, sun will shine upon both the good and the evil every morning, day in, day out. Everything takes the chronological order. To Cyclonopedia at this level has a sort of, it appears like, it's just a romance. It's an airport thriller, right? Cyclonopedia is essentially a failed airport thriller. Happens like, oh, I found this manuscript and in the airport, and we are in love, except that we didn't, find this guy who promised me to come to Turkey. Total French, great. But then scrap it one layer or one scale further, then things start to unravel. Then this is the time, literary time, or philosophical time, where basically everything becomes cryptic. The voice of the author becomes fundamentally unreliable. The audience who are reading it becomes paranoid because they don't know what sort of material they are looking at. Some might come as absolutely true, but some are absolute bullshit as we know it, right? So intentionally fake information, fake news. And then ultimately, if you scrape all of these layers down, the third scale, the pathogenesis, the source of trauma, you see the desert. And that's when basically you say that this is obviously not a novel. This is obviously not a respectable work of theory. But what can it be? The answer to that question, I would say that Ibrahim al-Kuni, the Libyan writer and the desert nomad, had already answered. The genesis of a novel, by all definition, is linked to the genesis of polis, of city, of settlement. But so far, we did not have a work of so-called literature that takes place in the desert. Because deserts relation with settlement, with city, and politics, and polis is way too ambivalent. For after all, desert is the place that revealed itself to the humanity once the great flood receded. Thank you. Oh, you are mute.
Erfan, where would you want to go? I see like some comments, some questions maybe on the side, or can I continue on with Reza? How much time do we have? It's already an
I
hour and a half.
mean, yeah, it's hour and a half, but Reza's talks are famously long. So, and we are all prepared in Tehran and Oslo. We are prepared for it.
Particularly
Reza,
in Iran.
Reza, what kind of business as usual it is? Because I want to say like we're actually maybe like
Grandma, what sort of bag is it?
what grandma, what kind of bag is that? What kind of business as usual it is where like you see like Trump bowing down in Qatar to the rulers of a country that has been supporting Hamas, has been supporting Islamic insurgency, has been supporting ISIS, and basically placing them above their historic ally in the region called Israel, not necessarily becoming enemy of Israel, but basically reordering. Like Israel is getting downgraded, just like American credit is getting downgraded. And like what I don't think this is so much business as usual. This is in the words of Palestinian commentators themselves, is like a real big shift that's taking place. Now, this is not necessarily a digging of a hole way too deep as you would like it, but it's definitely an attempt to scratch the surface and scratch this normalcy, or replace that normalcy with a new business as usual that is very unusual for all of us who witnessed.
When we say business as usual, we don't mean that it would be repeat of the older story of business as usual. Business as usual ultimately technically gets upgraded.
Just to wrap it up, basically throughout his campaign, Trump accused the Democrats and the establishment of creating a condition for Arab countries to use, or the Gulf countries, sorry, to use the price of oil to accumulate wealth, where it was America that provided them the security for them to create this economy, right? But while maintaining this line of argument, he's basically saying America's bankrupt, and we're going to downgrade our ally that cost us money, and basically become close to allies that can actually give us money, buy more Boeings, invest more money into our economy, because we need that kind of allies. And America cannot afford to borrow money to support an ally in the region, even though the objection to Israel is not moral or ethical, it's pure economic. And these are the very same people that yesterday being blamed for fomenting hate and fundamentalism in the region, blah blah blah. But we see that they're now being called like, oh, you know, I don't know if you know what happened. Trump basically took the metaphor that everybody used for Israel, that like, you guys make the desert bloom, and then they compared it to Iran and said, you Arabs have made the desert bloom. I mean, if I was Israel, I would call copyright on
That's
that.
out of
I would call
the
copyright on that.
second
I would
Dune.
say, pardon me?
Dune. That's like a Dune. I will deliver you to the green paradise.
And even Ayatollah Khamenei yesterday made a comment about like saying like, you can't compare Iran to Arab countries. If it wasn't for American support, these Gulf states would not be able to create these vertical urban spaces in the desert. So they did it with your help. So there's nothing there to celebrate, right? So to me, I think there's something some shift is taking place, and that doesn't mean that Palestinians are going to be saved or celebrated or given sovereignty. I think
No, I would say that by all connotations and all the indications at this point, I think Palestinian peoples are going to get the wrong side of the stick, and absolutely will be forced out, displaced, brutally, treated. I don't think that we should, in any sort of way, think that Palestinians at this point have any sort of bright future. No, I think the worst has not even yet come for Palestinians, unfortunately.
unfortunately.
And that shows the depth of complicity with anonymous materials here.
Okay, now that we went over some of the more juicy stuff to talk about. So what do you mean by Eurotrauma?
Eurotrauma or Urtrauma. So Urtrauma is, so you see, in the early ages of psychoanalysis, I mean, of course, Freud had already written, the scientific paper on the history of psychoanalysis or psychology, which he, down the line, completely negated. But nevertheless, retained some of the, major traits of his earlier work. So Urtrauma used to come as this very understanding that, when, as I said about the psychology, when we are trying to think about the explainer or explaining factors for our motivations, actions, convictions, obligations, so on and so forth, we always go back to something within life that, maybe my mommy did something wrong to me. Maybe I was brought up in Iran, during Iran-Iraq war. And then I, So it's confined to a very specific scale. So this is called ur-trauma, original trauma. But then Otto Rank wrote a piece which is extremely speculative. And then Sandor Frenzy, who was Hungarian, a psychoanalyst and a disciple of Freud, wrote even a more speculative piece on this, Thalassa, also the clinical diaries, where they started to talk about ur trauma, originary trauma, meaning that maybe the pathogen that causes trauma cannot be found in one's life. Maybe it has something to do of a cosmological origin. You see, and that's also coming back to Cyclonopedia, right? The Cyclonopedia doesn't actually talk about Middle Easterners that much. You know, I could talk about just like every day in the 1360s about, you know, just going strolling on the street and see, you know, goddamn mayhem caused by the war, and then explain all this stuff by way of what has just happened, or the Middle East. But then think about this, and if you go one scale further to the third level that I mentioned, then we are not actually talking about life anymore. We are talking about cosmological origins of trauma. And trauma, what is really trauma, you might ask? Well, I mean, the word trauma simply means wound, right? Trauma is an aperture, a peephole, a spy hole into the most ingenious structures of the universe. So, from the psychoanalytic perspective, trauma seems always to be responsible for what we compelled to do. But from the perspective of the depth of the trauma, it is what makes us who we are and proud. Like I am a proud Iranian, sure. I have immigrated to America, but nevertheless, you and I and so many other people are proud to be Iranian. And we are not going to simply put it under the carpet just because we want to, you know, satisfy some Western audience who didn't have that sort of experience. Cyclonopedia is essentially about this.
So Reza, are you talking about these two, you said from the perspective of the inside and perspective of the outside, is that the exogenic and endogenic, or am I getting it wrong?
Exogenic and endogenic,
Or
yes.
maybe explain that, these two different relationships that the cut has with the inside and with the outside.
Trauma. So you see, in Freud's Beyond Pleasure and Principle, at the very least, and also early essays, you know, the scientific paper on the psychophysics of psychology, the trauma of life, and life is itself, in Freud's terms, is a form of trauma, right? But this trauma is always essentially being pitted against the source of the ultimate energy that gives life life. What is that source of energy? It's of course sun. And Bataille was completely aware of this in Accursed Share, right? So this creates a certain sort of Western mentality about psychology, that life has so many ways to live, and these are called lifestyles, but not lives, lifestyles. right? Hipsterism, so to speak. But only one way to the outside. And what is that way to the outside? Is
Death.
essentially death by the sun, by the source of the goddamn energy that enables life to begin with on the surface of the planet.
Remember Pierre's work in Punta de la Dagana, the body, dead body in the sun and the dry land. It just reminded me of that image. Remember, we sat there and watched that, and the cameras
You
are going
can see it.
around.
You can see it in the desert. You can see it. And yes, absolutely. So, and of course, this comes back to this European romanticism, where basically you see it in Venice, in Italy, in Vienna, in Switzerland, where basically all characters are so vibrant, except that their relation to the outside is so parochial as fuck. And that sums up Western attitude to life, say, from a literary perspective.
But Reza,
They go to the Viennese cafe, they go to this, they have sex, they have bed, they have these gossips, they do art and this. But when it comes to the relation to what is outside of these parochial parameters of life, they have no answer. They cannot think beyond that. So they are essentially a monogamous relationship with the outside. They are into the business of outside monogamy.
So, okay, isn't this what the good old land when he was still a leftist in the first chapter of Fang Numena is talking about? When he's talking about the exact same thing, and then he talks about this radical, what does he call it? Like radical, like incest, right? Like that like that he wants to instigate this radical incest with the outside because the West has this monogamous, very monogamous
I would
relationship.
say land, yes, in Thirst for Annihilation, land, absolutely, by all definition, intimated to a certain sort of critique of this sort of Western attitude, right, to life and also death. But given the fact that land never graduated fully from the Bataillean solar excess, what essentially enables this sort of lifestyle, the conditions of possibility of this sort of lifestyle to begin with, he never cut across to the outside. He is unfortunately, like our friend POV, remains always and always eternally at the liminal Western parameters, liminal space. But this liminal space simply means a bullshit space. It is neither here nor there, but most probably always wants to have its attachment to a certain sort of fidelity to this sort of life under capitalism, under the sun, this and that, while glorifying the outside, right? Because this is the whole point. If you do not manage, like in Middle Eastern, to overcome your relation with the outside by renegotiating what life might actually mean on the desert, you most probably will end up glorifying the sun, the outside, capitalism, or any sort of avatars of that.
Okay, so one note here, Reza.
Sure.
The event is not organized by Eflux. It's just advertised by Eflux because Eflux seeks rent.
That is
Eflux seeks
actually
rent.
even better,
And we all
because then
pay that
when I
rent.
said something
We all
about
pay
Eflux,
that
that
rent, man.
doesn't. Nevertheless, okay, then Eflux deserves to get that fucking, a little
Criticism?
bit of thorn on the side, and Of course, we are friends with Eflux. There's no bad blood here, right? People who understands how I work. I'm merely delivering what I have always been doing.
Yeah, well, as the co-founder of the Terra Summit, I need to mention that we are using the business as usual of the efflux to distribute
Business
our
as usual.
صراط غير مستقيم, our counter institutional message, you know,
Like,
and reach out to I mean non-Europeans, you know, because without that it's just us and the Iranians, and we cannot reach people outside.
no,
And
I would say that we can actually reach, but that requires organization. Unfortunately, we are not good at the organization at this point because,
Reza, speak for
after
yourself.
all,
Speak for yourself.
you're talking to the new center
Organize that,
dude,
man.
man. Yeah, that's exactly.
no,
But the thing is,
no,
like being based in Iran is so hard because, and also at the same
that's
time,
what I wanted to say. Mo
I'm
and I are outside, so we can do something that unfortunately people in Iran cannot do.
that's why we are collaborating, man. And that's why I'm collaborating with Bo.
I know.
These are
But
like
then you have to
tactics,
take,
the harba.
but yes, but then you have to, as an Iranian, you have to call them on their bullshit. What are you afraid of? Worst case scenario, you become a shaheed tomorrow.
Sure. I mean, I don't
Sure.
argue with that. I do not argue with that.
Okay, so let's, like it's been now, like, should we open it up a little bit? People have questions. And
Sure,
I think
absolutely.
I can take the conversation somewhere nice. Like for those of you who are, I want to actually bring Carl into conversation if Carl Olsen's in the room, because Carl kind of put the weight of physics on this picture you draw with a paper he gave just a few days ago at ICI in Berlin with this like centrality of gravity. So if you put gravity and light, right, versus sun and the black sun, right? And Carl's paper was about gravity. So maybe I just throw that at you, Reza. So what do you think is the relationship between this anonymous material, this black sun, this fascist black sun, this anonymous material, this petroleum at the center of the earth, and the concept of gravity that pulls life back into the crust and also make life possible?
No, I'm pretty sure that some artist at this point listening to us is going to curate a show where basically gravitation is fascist by definition.
I see Carl here at Georgiana's screen. Maybe Carl can bring it up, and you two can talk about the black sun and gravity, and we get somewhere with that.
Thank you for the conversation so far. I mean, I feel like I have the entire night tomorrow, so I think maybe there is someone who will have something more interesting than me to say. But yeah, I mean, essentially, of course, even if the sun is sort of one of the things that are giving us lives, of course, we are also subject to a number of different conditions for life have emerged on Earth. And I think one
Gravitation,
question
it
that is
would be the
perhaps less,
ultimate one.
yeah, well,
But people don't
ultimate
want to
perhaps.
talk about gravitation. You see, once you are the damned of the earth, so to speak, Franz Fanon again, the wretched of the air, you always think that, oh, well, terrestrialism, meaning a vertical concept of gravity is all there is. And essentially, you see all of this stuff from Thomas Moynihan, even Land. There is a grain of truth to all of this, precisely because the genesis of the organism on the surface of the planet, sure, absolutely, an accretion of the trauma of gravitation, if you want to talk about a cosmological sense. But obviously, people want to have vertical gravity. Vertical gravity. Vertical gravity, Earth's gravity is all there is. Look into the, I'm pretty sure that you're completely familiar with this sort of literature, into the literature of proto-math by Giuseppe Longo, by other sort of people, where basically even the genesis of mathematics, which is a timeless enterprise, is somehow always brought back to this idea that, well, you know, precisely because gravity, the vertical gravitational pull of the Earth, create a sense of movement among the biospecies who could, for example, create a proto-abstraction of a line by virtue of how they have evolved, like the saccade of the eye movement, like the inner ear, which is responsive to the vertical gravitational pull, and so on and so forth. So even in that sense, you see, people always want the terrestrial gravitational pull, not gravitation par excellence.
No, but of course we have to, if we are sort of departing from the Earth, we have to begin with the conditions that affect us most in the present that we are in. But that said, the point is not really about gravity or even it's certainly not about Earth's gravity alone, even though that may be a starting point. But the problem is, just as there is a tendency to refer everything to gravity, isn't there a risk that we make the same mistake by referring everything to the sun and kind of erect this ultimate final principle?
Yes, of
Isn't
course,
the challenge
That would be a certain sort of
precisely,
vulgar
Reza?
materialism. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
No, absolutely. But that I wanted to say that, look, gravitation is more essentially has more effect on the terrestrial life on the surface, on the biosphere, than what you might say that, well, you know, vertical gravitational pull of the Earth. But any sort of relegation of the focus of our traumas to a specific substrate risks vulgarity, intellectual materialist vulgarity. Simple as that. Cyclonopedia subtitle is very clear, and complicity with anonymous materials. We are not saying with one material. It's not about vital materialism. It's not about triple O. It is literally how all of these are somehow connected. And then our self-discovery is simply a form of historical self-discovery through a very specific locale in which we reflect upon the genesis of our own kind, right? And that reflection obviously cannot simply explain the way by one or two or three or multiple substrates of fundamental kind.
But there is nevertheless a very practical problem here, and that is sort of, if in writing such a history, it has to deal with concrete substrates in some way. Is that not true? Because otherwise it becomes incredibly impractical to conduct. How, without sort of going
When we
through?
say concrete substrates, do we mean concrete from a historical materialist sort of way?
No, I mean,
or do we mean it by way of a, you know, kind of a vital materialist sort of way?
I mean, it's simply in the sense of having to choose something in order to investigate. You have to have an object for this investigation, and there will be an object of thought that you
The
have
object of
to
investigation is
identify.
already there, I would say. We have had, and this is what I wanted to say, and you're quite familiar with this. I would say that the object of investigation are the numbers of the so-called great humiliations that have been levied against the human species, regardless of where they have come from. People usually take it, Freud at least takes it, that the first one started with Copernicus, but I'm pretty sure that it had already started before Copernicus, as we know it historically. Then
It's Marx. Let's just
Newton,
put
then
Marx there, please.
Darwin, then Darwin,
Darwin and Marx.
Freud and Marx. Absolutely. So the concrete
Copernicus,
here
Darwin,
is what you might
Freud,
call to be
and
the,
Marx.
yes. So the concrete here is essentially how we have reflected upon what you might call to be the substrate, right? And at each epoch, historical epoch of consciousness, I would say that yes, we have get a better grasp of what this might be. But of course, people do. You might be a Marxist, and you say, well, anything that Darwin said can be taken with a grain of salt, or at least you have just a morsel of Darwin and too much of Marx, too much of Darwin, a little bit of Marx. No, this is also another process. But of course, a work of literature can never account for this sort of what you might call to be dialectics between world making or epoch making consciousness of how we come into contact, in concrete contact with the substrates, right? Capitalism, natural selection, and so on and so forth. I would say that, and that's why I said it early, that maybe literature is not actually the best medium to address these sort of questions, because it ultimately fails. But sometimes in this literary failure, we create magnificent sort of stuff, right? So Irfan was reading Surat al-Takwir, and I remember back in the day, I suggested this TV series to Mo, which he fell in love with.
You mean
Midnight Mass. Midnight Mass.
I was just with some people, and they called Midnight Mass the best television series they've ever watched. And
The best.
A lot of people agree that it's a magnificent film because magnificent TV series, because for 4/5 of the series, you don't know what genre it belongs to. And you can feel comfortable by saying like, oh, it's horror.
Yes,
Oh,
and
it's
the fact that it culminates with Surat al-Takwir, where basically this Muslim sheriff of some podunk in America says that, you are going to kill me. But let me reiterate a surah from Quran, that the sun tomorrow morning will shine upon both the good and the evil. Then in that context, it makes absolute sense. So sometimes I think that literature is great, but once, calibrated within the context of, as I said, literature by definition cannot cope with this complexity of stuff that, for example, me and Carl want literature to perform.
Reza, so when normal people ask me, so what is Cyclonopedia about? Can you just summarize it in a few sentences? I'll tell you the vulgar reading I give to people, right? I say, okay, so this book is about the fact that the star called sun shines upon Earth and basically creates life on Earth, and then life on Earth is basically like a synthesis between the sun and the crust of the Earth. But then but then this cross creates these natural beings that then die and get buried, and then they're basically children of the sun. And the children of the sun are stuck somewhere between the core of the earth and the crust. And from there, they're basically planning an insurgency to liberate sun from the earth and take over. So this is about a sort of like insurgency of this child that the sun has with the earth, which is hiding underneath the crust of the earth. So that's sort of like my vulgar reading elevator pitch version of Cyclonopedia. What do you think about it? Really vulgar, right? Did we lose him?
Yeah, I think so. Reza, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Kind of.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you
Yeah,
now.
it's
But your
better here.
camera-
Okay, my apologies, my apologies. No, the idea of insurgency, of course, June 2 came, and absolutely, it was the most majestic, as I told you, and I told some of my students, one of the most majestic movies in the history of Western canon of cinema. It is as if, and this is a joke for Iranian people, it is as if Sepah Pastaran Enqilab Islami had funded this movie in Hollywood, right? IRCG had funded this movie. And the insurgency, yes, absolutely. The whole point of the Cyclonopedia is about insurgency, in the sense that, look, you are having this sort of life, and you have this sort of relationship with your ecosystem writ large. Yeah, capitalism, monarchy, oil, desert. But you eventually, within that setup, if it understood correctly, you will be an insurrectionary force. So insurgency, yes, but that is not. I would say that this is kind of like a literally Cyclopedia 101. I would say that most people should know already that Cyclopedia is a book about insurrection, right? Except that it's written in cryptic sort of way under taqiyya.
Can I ask a
This
question?
also sounds like, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Georgiana. Just following what you just Reza said. Um, I have two actually like questions from Reza, which is one of the definitions of Cyclonopedia that you mentioned among the many is that the Cyclonopedia is about different techniques of killing God. And I want to know how to kill a god that's everywhere and is among any causal relationship, like a gas.
Well, do you want an honest answer or a kind of like
A Taghiya one?
a taqiyya one?
Oh, this is for Iranians, Reza. You promised to tell the truth. So just lay it on the ground.
No, absolutely. I would say that Land was right. He saw through the book. The book is fundamentally monotheistic and tawhidi in its every definition. That it goes through a very, very surreptitious sort of circuitous way, labyrinthine way, to talk about God and gods, venerate gods, of all sorts of scales, the abyss, so on and so forth, right? The demons of the Assyrian Empire, so on and so forth, only come back with this definition that there is no other way for insurgency, for revolution, that to kill all other gods. What is it if not the ultimate mission of Tawheed, right? Of Tawheed, of monotheism. Monotheism is actually, I'm using the word Tawheed precisely because it's far more an interesting concept than this Western translation monotheism. The idea of Tawheed, to kill gods. Yes.
And if you're done, would you say the same thing that you said for oil? Or other anonymous materials that are sort of the contemporary subjects like uranium and lithium, how they are narrating our world today, especially in relation
Yes.
to the Middle East.
Yes. I mean, essentially, I mean, we cannot simply say, well, you know, we can eject ourselves from the oil economy and this sort of stuff. It's just natural part of the, you know, socioeconomic structuration in which we unfortunately have been ingrained. Yes, absolutely. That also means, in tongue-in-cheek sort of manner, to get rid of every sort of connections with these so-called anonymous material, right? Arab countries might not have that, right? I mean, as a country who has gone through all sorts of unimaginable and imaginable tribulations in history, we at least owe to each other to get rid of certain sorts of attachments and associations with these sort of tropes that usually people associate with us, right? And of course, this is not at the surface level of someone like, you know, the foreign minister of oil industry in Venezuela during the early time of the OPEC, who had already mentioned this sort of stuff. Look, you know, the worst thing that can happen to an oil country is that they are going to eat the feces of devil. He called oil devil's shit, devil's experiment, right? Everyone knows that. Even Arabic countries know that you know, attachments with this sort of materials will eventually get you into a very specific sort of historical dynamics. But of course, Arabic countries like, you know, Emirat, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth are just swapping oil with what you might call to be the new oil, which would be a stock market, you know, property, real estate in the Western society. No, what I'm talking about is really imagining what really genuinely take us as a very ancient civilization to get out of this quagmire of this sort of anonymous, shady materials to which we have become a puppet. And people abuse us precisely because they think we are a puppet, right? Puppets of these sort of materials. We haven't. And of course, you see, this is the whole idea of the Iranian revolutionary circle, starting with Mohammad Khiyabani, the great sheikh who created what, 48 hours, 72 hours of the Azadistan of Iran. So even people, Mo and I usually talk about this person, Ahmad Kasravi. You know, Ahmad Kasravi was beheaded by all the Phoenicians. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got himself killed for no fucking reason. He had essentially alienated so many people, but he knew something that, look, we need to get out of this, but he just didn't know exactly how we can get out of this. His understanding of how we can get out of it was that I told Mo that in one of his texts he said we can become Switzerland. Oh, thank you, Ahmad. You know, no, we are not going to be another Switzerland. We are, after all, Iran. Shariati had talked about this. You know, all of these people that we just take for granted, because of course we are grown up with these sort of figures. But I think that they all contributed to these sort of questions. I don't think that we still have that sort of answer because we don't have that sort of full consciousness of how we are exactly are going on the day after the revolution and make a better place out of Iran. In that sense, we are still young revolutionary. Even though, Islamic Republic, Islamic Revolution, or Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979, what is it? Like almost 50 years old. Almost.
Georgiana.
Yeah. Oh, so thank you, Reza and Mohammad, for
Thank you so much for being
contributions.
here.
I forgot my question. I think I was a bit riled by your comments about literature. I'm gonna die on this.
No, I mean, you showed as a European.
Uh, but no, in good fun. I wanted to combat this idea, and perhaps it applies for art. I don't know.
Georgia,
That
before
literature.
anything else, we have to congratulate you for the election in your country because we talked about real stuff. So I just thought because you were very passionate about like how horrible it is that like we have to go for the neoliberal guy, but then the neoliberal guy actually beat the far right guy. So just wanted to like put that on the table because we talked a lot about to decentralize from Middle East into like other important areas of the world. So yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I barely caught some sleep last night, but I knew, like I told you, I knew the far right guy's not going to win because the methods used in the United States, for example, or in the West, to co-opt the electorate towards this far right ethno-nationalism, blah blah, don't work everywhere. And if you don't make an effort to understand how much we also dislike or we also have other enemies, other common enemies, then you're gonna do a sloppy job. And that's what happened, and I'm glad it did. Now, that doesn't mean we need to sleep on that. And actually, I think now more than ever, there needs to be a return to almost like a radical form of orthodoxy, which means, yeah, a recuperation of the collective, a recuperation of sociality, um, basically asking people, if you want me to believe your bullshit, like, um, maybe distribute your resources or find your way to a community center, a retirement home, uh, train or coach a child who might be yeah, lost and in need of a bit of guidance and so on. So yeah, but back to literature, um, which is somehow also tied, or some literature is tied to situations like these, which do have a tinge of trauma or hint at this. But of course, if you just render it like so, you're not writing literature, you're writing a confessional form of literature, is journaling, diary, which
Personal
of course,
biography.
sorry?
Personal biography.
And now it's also the derivatives, autofiction, auto theory, and all that bullshit, which of course is something that sells very well on the Western literary market, and unfortunately, many other uh, literatures of the world sometimes, out of a desire for visibility, for being noticed, copy the same model. So it's also a matter of complicity with not such anonymous materials, just with the book industry and so on. I wanted to ask two questions to Reza. Like, would you say that a work of literature and an all-encompassing work of literature such as the Brother Karamazov's by Dostoevsky, with its like non-Euclidean geometry, we're hinting at uh, and oh yeah, probably Christian. Or even the short story within this novel, The Great Inquisitor, which although refers only to this kind of, yeah, very local, very contextualized moment of Inquisitor meets actual Jesus, and they discuss about how much he should actually be part of the world now that the church has created its institutions of control, and how much people deserve that freedom, or are they just like some stupid little lambs that need to be controlled by the church? But I would say that this is also a larger engagement with deeper traumatic layers of the cosmos, if you like. If we dare to take it out of, Christian theology, and what Dostoevsky is doing there is, of course, a sort of Christian mysticism and so on. Uh, but not only, and I and I would say that in that regard, his writing kind of outsmarts his own probably personal biographical loyalties, which was Christian orthodoxy and so on, a bit of socialism, but not too much, um, because he also was against, I don't know, fads like Russians going to Paris and coming and preaching at the at soirees about socialism and so on, but actually doing nothing for the indentured serfs and so on. And the second is the fact that there are a, a bunch of poets, for example, that uh, kind of share these anti-confessional, but it's not even an anti. It goes without saying that one's biographies besides the point, but rather that poetry is the sort of well, unlike philosophy, maybe it doesn't have its own means of self-inquiry, but it does have other attributes or other advantages. One would be um, a level of commitment and compromise with chaos that is very hard to endure, but via which a sort of evolution, a sort of transformation, a sort of guidance by the source of knowledge can occur. If I may, if I make sense, it's also like almost a sort of adaptability and response to be able to carry on. Like the sort of music we can create to fucking dance a tiny bit while we think. And maybe even the universe itself needs to listen to its own music in a way. I don't know. Hope I'm not being too ambiguous.
No, not at all.
My question is
Magnificent.
like if your rant is you know, like with this kind of canonical purpose of literature, which changes with the ages. And today, for example, there is a brilliant Turkish-American literary critic, Merve Emre, who published, I think it was a podcast about the leader's reader and the repurposing of modernist literature in business schools.
What's the name? What's the name, Georgia?
Merve Emre.
Would you be able to type it on the chat box?
Yes, she wrote Personality Brokers about the Myers-Briggs. Where is the chat? Merve Emre. The Myers-Briggs personality test, and like, which is huge in the United States, but she comes from a literary perspective on it. And in the leader as reader, yeah, she says business schools have no problem, you know, teaching about the absurdity of life and of the human condition and how leaders should rise above with the help of literatures such as Kafka, such as Dostoevsky. In Italy, then what's the name of that lady, the far right? Repurposes,
Yeah.
like she recodes Dante.
Maloney.
Yes, she recodes
Malone.
Dante and Tolstoy as, you know, like sort of sharing with basically with far right meanings and systems of signification and so on.
I see. I see.
Yeah. So is this the literature you're referring towards, or like beyond these sort of like West?
Yes, I mean, I would say that, look, I mean, I knew that someone is going to bring someone like Dostoevsky to me, right?
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, Dostoevsky is great by all definition. But Dostoevsky also, you see, really the spirit of Dostoevsky shining into Tarkovsky's movies in a certain sort of way. That Dostoevsky is like literally at some point, not every time, at some point only cares about this sort of, what you might call to be the moment between faith and unfaith. In a sense that many giants of literature fall before this sort of trait. American giants of literature, such as Cormac McCarthy, who now has been, unfortunately, but I'm not surprised really, has been, you know, exposed as a groomer of young women,
After
right?
his death,
Young
you mean?
girls. After his death, he always said that literature is nothing but the definition of life versus death, right? This sort of stuff, unfortunately, needs to be taken seriously. These are not merely, you know, someone saying it, some white author saying this. I would say if we really genuinely look into the history of the American literature, we should see, you know, Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, all these giants, right? Who are they? Of course, are communists, but macho communists who do believe in certain sort of version of social Darwinism, of this sort of understanding. With Dostoevsky, of course, given the fact of his background, where he came from, it becomes a matter of faith versus unfaith. But Dostoevsky, in broader chromosomes, and particularly in Demon, shines through. He truly shines through. And this is, I would say, there is a difference between the Eastern tradition of literature, at the very least in Russian, what we are talking about, and the Eastern Europe, as opposed to the Western. This has something to do with how Marxism, or essentially proto-Marxism, the understanding of materials and materiality, and labor, and all of this start to influence people. I remember I had this talk with Muhammad just like a few weeks ago. And Muhammad, I wasn't talking to Muhammad for a while, and then we connected back again, and we had this sort of click. But basically, Muhammad said that, well, Marxism unfortunately has never emerged in its sincerity in the West. Marxism is essentially for the working class. And if you really look into the history of Marxism, where Marxism is absolutely successful,
Operationalized.
Operationalized, absolutely operationalized, as opposed to some sort of hipster literary genre, is in Russia,
Or
in
China,
China,
or
in
Vietnam,
Africa, in
or
Iran,
Cambodia,
or
yeah,
in
or
India,
Iran, or Bulgaria,
yes,
or Romania, or whatever. Yeah.
or Romania, but not goddamn fucking France, but not in Italy even.
Not even Germany.
No, no. Oh, my Germany is the worst, the worst. So I know in that sense, I would say that yes, there is a definition of literature that maybe some authors, by the virtue of where they have come from, it's a really important sort of question. By virtue of where they have come from, they can transcend literature above that sort of Western canon that I try to criticize. By definition, I would say some of the works of Dostoevsky, even though, Stanislav Lem said that, after Tarkovsky made Stanislav Lem Solaris, said, these Russians don't know anything. They want to turn everything into crime and punishment, right? So I'm not talking about the crime and punishment, Dostoevsky. I'm talking about demons. I'm talking about Brother Karamazov, which I absolutely loved when I read it as a teenager. These works do transcend precisely because this is peak Dostoevsky knowing where he has come from and truly moves beyond that sort of Western decrepit framework of literature. But even in the Western literature, you get someone like Leigh Beckett. Right? Leigh Beckett is magnificent, precisely because it is, and it's your second question, it is a bridge between prose and poetry in a very specific sort of way, where basically he brings his own Irishness into the fold.
Reza, just before you continue, I just want to have one little saying. As someone not very well versed like you or Georgiana in the question of literature, for me, literature most of the time functions like culture, whereas poetry functions more like pure creativity or art, not in a contemporary
Or
art sense,
philosophy,
but-
or philosophy, or
or
philosophy.
And you know what I mean? Like if you look at like the new definitions of what is like basically like the overlap between intelligence and life. What is life? What is intelligence? I mean, I spent 2 full days, one day in Venice at Bergrugen with like the Bergrugen people and like Benjamin and Thomas, and then one day in Berlin ICI with Carl and again the whole crew. The overlap between life and intelligence kind of like is closer to poetry, which is new pattern recognition and compression. I'm not saying literature doesn't do that, but poetry seems to be more interested in these two operations. That is what the overlap between life and intelligence, according to these new theories that are emerging out of people who compare artificial intelligence and artificial life with life and human intelligence.
Absolutely, and I would say that the reason for it is, I mean,
Thank you.
sure, we can say that, Georgiana. I mean, I still do. I'm not going to say this publicly, but nevertheless, I'm going to say to Iranian public, because Iranians love their own poetry, right? I would say that I still do follow poetry, right? World poetry. But we know that it's in a sad, sorry state, particularly, I mean, having been in Brooklyn is here, some Brooklyn poetry.
Oh, fuck that. But I think I need to introduce you to some very good poetry that I've been
Yeah.
reading.
Oh,
But
yes,
just
of course.
to speak also to Mo's point, poiesis, and we had Michael Levine, the crazy Yale guy who puts
Unbelievable, right? It was just unbelievable, right?
who makes
So
the
poetry, by
Picasso
definition,
total
is a
that puts
compression of abstraction, right? A compression of abstraction.
but
That
more than that,
obviously cuts across the divide between the concrete and the abstract. It
more
has
than that,
more, it has more, I would say, chance to reach the concrete than literature could ever do, unfortunately.
What were you saying, Georgiana?
I would say that just like adaptability, for example, in this case, they put eyes on the tail of the toads, and then the brain readapted and so on. They don't understand how this is happening because it happens on the fly. So just like poetry, you don't have to exit survival mode of trauma, geopolitical, personal, all of them combined, to have this kind of faith or guidance that you don't know exactly where it leads to, but you still exercise it, you still practice it, and it's a
This is
form of
because
creativity
you
in
have
a way.
invented new techniques that are not literary par excellence. See, you have different sort of techniques. A poet
But I
has
would
different
say
techniques
that,
that a literary writer doesn't exactly own, I would say.
but it's not a matter of ownership. It's like what the guy was describing about the cell and its repurposing. I'm like, wait a minute,
But
haven't I
he has
read this
techniques,
in?
right?
But
He
it's
has
not, I'm not
techniques.
speaking about technique is one thing. And maybe you can pinpoint it, and some, empirical courses like creative writing courses really take this literally. And there are advice for, I don't know, young writers by Clayton Eshelman, by Rilke, by everybody. But then there is this kind of unexplainable, when it does happen, need to move on, to move forward, to guide life towards life, not towards death. And this kind of
Yes. No, I completely get this. But I'm saying technique, you should understand when I'm saying technique, I don't mean technique in the vulgar sense. I mean technique, a way of knowing, a way of
right.
knowing,
Okay,
a
now I'm
way of
ready,
knowing,
Lisa.
right?
Sorry.
A way of knowing, a way of knowing, of course. But then, unfortunately, nothing of this person has been ever translated to English language, only excerpts. There is this guy in history of Iran who, killed because of his, what you would call to be heretical or apathetic challenge to Shia Islam. And of course, he's coming from a fundamentally Shia Muslim family. His name is Ahmad Kasravi. So Kasravi wrote a number of books. One is called Roman, on the novel. One on Hafiz, which is the greatest, supposedly the greatest poet of Iran. One on Sufism, basically on the entirety of the organon of mysticism. And one on Shiaism. He said that none of these are actually making sense. You see, I, as a person who love literature, who love poetry, who love art, even though I talk in extremely critical manners about all of these agendas, I think that what he said was kind of right. What does poet have ever achieved? What do novelists achieve? Not. Maybe you might say that, yes, we have achieved this and that. But Kasravi is essentially someone who really genuinely believes represents the modern Iran at the dawn of the 20th century. And at this point, no one takes him seriously. Even the greatest novelists, modern novelists of the time, Sadegh Elayat.
Can you
I
please
think
write down their names in the chat, please?
Yes, Ahmad Kasravi.
I will be doing that right now. Reza, you continue.
So Kasravi makes this thing that, look, when it comes to a concrete situations of a very specific place, and I'm pretty sure that Romania would count as one of them, and Iran would be also one. But
Not
nevertheless,
the Romania of 2025, but maybe the Romania of 1991.
yes. That's
Now
actually
it's
a very good question.
complicity with Western.
Yes. Western, yes. So Kasravi essentially wants to say, look, guys, none of this stuff, this idea of a novel, and he has a very really bad taste in novel. He has most probably has read it.
Reza, you disappeared. And your voice disappeared.
We cannot hear you, Reza.
Signals going in and out, I guess. It would be great to answer the other question as well, right?
Yeah, we have Niam and also
Niam.
a question from Shaham. And we need to be mindful of the time as well.
Yes.
Yeah, because of our partners in Oslo.
Yeah, it's getting late in Europe.
Yeah.
9:30.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back. Reza, there's two more questions, and there's time constraints.
Sure, absolutely. Let's go.
Niam, and also a comment from Shaham that you can read.
So who translated the Shaham comment? Is that the automated AI?
I don't know.
Pretty good.
But,
okay, so why don't
Niam,
are you here?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Reza.
Hello, Niam.
Hi,
hello.
how you doing?
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm a latecomer. I didn't get the time right.
Love you.
I'm also, I have to confess, I haven't read Cyclonopedia either. So, I'm parasizing
here. You do not
here.
need to read Cyclonopedia. Please don't do it.
It's on my bookshelf, so I'll get around to it. But I wanted to ask you about myopia. And the failure to see the implication of attachment to anonymous materials, like a function of hyper risk management, false consciousness in Marx, unconscious in Freud, the defense against these kind of demons that are named becomes a weapon turned back on the human, and I'm just wondering, does any insurrection or overturning of this order, carry a kind of binary code of a mimetic impulse, how we understand adaptation.
That would be the history of jihad. That would be the history of jihad par excellence.
Yeah, projection of the god.
Yeah, absolutely. This is essentially, when in the Western, not an Iranian or Shia or genuine understanding of jihad, but really, this whole idea of jihad is cool, would essentially be part of that sort of scenario where you get this understanding that someone comes from a wealthy Arabic Gulf state and tries to expunge, all the complicities with anonymous materials, oil, capitalism, so on and so forth, back into the desert of Sunnah, meaning the radical understanding of Prophet Muhammad of Islam as a socialist project. And of course, in that sense, I would say that jihad is cool sort of paradigm. By no definition, I think that jihad is probably one of the greatest concepts of Islam itself. But the way that it has been used by certain sort of fundamentalists, particularly coming as insurrectionary forces within these extremely wealthy, what you might call to be authoritarian, rather oily, shady thing, it has put a different sort of valence on the understanding of jihad to scrap back and go back to the desert of Muhammad himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you see that there is a fundamental duplicity in that sort of business, in a sense that maybe from the perspective of the jihadi, they don't have any sort of relationship with the anonymous materials of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
But from the perspective of the state, the sponsors and exports them, ultimately, they have everything to do with capitalism.
Yeah.
As I mentioned to you, you remember when I said that desert has an ambivalent relationship with polis, with settlement, right? It does not mean that desert is the opposite of the polis, the city, of the republic of the Plato, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it has ambivalent relationship with it. And this ambivalent relationship have unfolded for the past couple of centuries within the Middle East, where basically you now are completely can see that a desert nomad can also be the architect of something like the Line or the Neil project, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Making the greatest, fastest hyper sky city from Saudi Arabia by displacing desert nomads onto the Gaza province, right? Mm. So we need to understand, the double edge of this discourse. Yeah. The desert nomad. The desert nomad, as Ibrahim Al-Kuni has understood, and Al-Kuni is, by definition, is a Libyan Tuareg, is a desert nomad. He already had envisioned that, look, desert by all definition has a duplicity with the problem of politics. That doesn't make it an antithesis to the problem of the empire.
So Reza, isn't the embodiment of this horizontal city the new government in Syria, which has its origin in ISIS and now is recognizing Israel and is eager to get the investment floating to the country? Isn't that the sort of like the end of that Takfiri project? Isn't this Syrian revolution, or like
The culmination of Takfiri project.
isn't that the culmination
I mean,
of the Takfiri project?
No, maybe we shouldn't jump the gun and say that, well, it's the culmination. But the very fact, as I told you, and might also be interested in this, the very fact that, of course, that Ahmad al-Shah, Jolani, of course, is president of New Syria, and he wants first and foremost, to get, sanctions lifted up. I would have done the same thing, but I wouldn't have done it under the same conditions. In the sense that he was a cool jihadist, a hot-headed person, and now he is a shit jihadist that tries to essentially, my apologies for using this word, Catholic imperialism.
But this
Going
is what
to
they
Saudi
expected.
Arabia in front of one of the most murderous psychopaths, who is MBS, shake the hand of Trump. I mean, is this the new Takfiri jihadist? Yes, Cyclonopedia always said so.
It said so.
It said so. It said so. This is the end of a Takfiri jihadist. But as I said, the word
Reza,
jihad
just to put you on
is
hold,
a fundamental concept.
this is exactly what Carter and administration thought the Iranian revolutionaries will do once they overthrew Shah. They expected the same attitude. Put on the suit, maybe have the beard, put on the suit, and come and say, we're going to join you against communism. We're going to be with you.
Necktie, like literally put a necktie and you become a mini civilized person, right? This shows the depth of the calamity in the Middle East at this point, where basically a former Takfiri jihadist who believes in the canonical version of Wahhabism, that everything needs to be flattened, right? And every infidel needs to be excommunicated, takfir wal hijra. So they say they are now wearing fucking necktie. I mean, is it anything more circus-like than this sort of
reversal
world?
He's putting on a suit, and Netanyahu is flattening everything that was standing vertical, man. It's just it's like this role reversal.
Mo,
Irfan, we have one more question, right? From
Shaham, and
maybe
please,
Shaham wants to come on and ask it himself or herself,
I don't know,
because I see
but
the room.
that's
Always shy.
yeah. And then, yeah, that can be our
Okay, maybe
last question. Can you read it, Mo?
I'll read it. So I'm going to read Shaham's, which comes both in Farsi and translated in English. Says, if according to
I see Shaham name on the thing. Why is it not coming? It's not.
maybe he doesn't want to appear,
Iranian is not so shy.
but Reza, the question's on the side, and Irfan asked me to read it. Do you want me to read it, or you're just going to read it and answer?
Sure, absolutely. You go read it.
I'm going to quickly read it. It says, if according to the hypothesis of Geotrauma Encyclopedia, the Middle East acts as a dynamic, self-aware hyper-object that, through petropolitics as a non-human agent, instigates a geological insurgency against Western epistemology, how might we reinterpret the tension between dark nominalism and the metaphysics of war machines within the framework of Gilles Deleuze's philosophy? So it's a comparison between dark nominalism and metaphysics of war machine versus what you set up in Cyclopedia. Specifically, does this geological insurgency, which recognizes oil as a demonic fluid subject, fundamentally reflect a post-anthropocentrism in opposition to the logic of zombie dynamism, wherein extraction and war machines are not human tools but autonomous intermediaries of petropolitical necromancy? It's really your
That's a
question.
good question. The only thing that, I mean, I hope that Shaham could say something. The only thing that I genuinely don't know exactly what it means is dark nominalism. I mean, I can only guess what dark nominalism might be, but I'm not going to speculate too much about this. I would say that
Reza, we kind of
there is
lost
a
you. Yeah,
fundamental
okay.
there is a fundamental complicity between the so-called dark nominalism and the imperialist factor, right? In a sense that you see how dynamics in the Middle East unfolds is by way of a bloated abstraction and a bloated sort of vital materials, triple O, right? Who takes everything as an agent, and the other one who is ultimately getting abstracted away from all such notions, right? And it is it's not per se an answer to Shaham, but something that most probably will be able to, down the line, answer this question according to Shaham's question. That I would say that what we are dealing with here in the Middle East is that, you know, this vulgar bunch who, you know, trying to reappropriate the culture of oil and oil extraction in new terms, right? And now in the philosophical, pseudo-philosophical sort of sense today, we have new materialism, triple O, you know, bacteria are agents, my dirty socks is an agent, oil is an agent, so on and so forth. Yeah, of course, everything that might be an agent, but you see, if everything is an agent, then there is nothing can be called an agent. Given the fact that agency is of a rational kind, meaning that it is beholden to the criteria of accountability and responsibility. But then there is a different side to this, and then that would be the true Middle Eastern oil exporters, right? Oil peddlers, where they try to make oil as abstract as possible. That their oil has nothing to do with any sort of thing that we can say as a constitutive material of today's capital. So oil is essentially the new ether, so to speak, right? Hava. And of course, at the end of the day, they find a very happy marriage, these two supposedly opposite sides. The over-abstraction of oil and the over-materialist vulgarization of oil find a very, very nice wedding in Texas, in LA, and in Dubai, at the expense of people like you, me, and the rest of the world. And that also needs to, again, be brought back to the fold of literature. And when we are talking about the constituents like earth, oil, water, so on and so forth, to say that, you know, obviously that basically the over abstraction and over inflation of material materials in the vulgar sense come hand in hand, like weird sisters in a Shakespeare play. Yes, Shaham, please go on. Say something about Dark Knight.
رضا جان 5 دقیقه بیشتر وقت نداریم. The session will automatically end.
Sure,
I'm sorry about that.
Absolutely.
We need to do this again. I'll talk to Mo for either another edition of the summit or something outside of this framework. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, Reza and Mo, for
my complete pleasure. And
absolutely, man.
Please do forgive me for any sort of criticism, but you are Iranian.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. Sorry.
You guys need criticism.
Yeah.
You know, Western people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Mo, for making this
Reza,
happen.
I don't even know where the criticism was. I didn't hear any criticism. I just felt like you made some comments on the side. I was waiting for some kind of like fire or something. But
Yeah.
anyway,
No,
Same.
I talked about white envy Ferrari became the prophetess of the anti-Deutsch. That was enough.
All right. All right, man. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining.
Erfan, thank you so much for providing this opportunity.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for the
Talk
collaboration.
openly about things that we, because of our own constraint, we can't really talk this much openly about in some of the more official news center events.
That's the whole point of the Terran Summit, to create this sort of spaces for people to talk.
Cheers.
And we appreciate the looks. See you all tomorrow night. And
See you tomorrow
thanks
for Carl and the rest of the team.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
absolutely. Bye.
Magnificent. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And good luck.
Thank you so much from Bo.
Love you. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.